Good evening, boys and girls, and welcome once again to Storytime with Grandma Pat. This evening, our story is going to be Little Red Riding Hood. This is a favorite story of mine also, and this story was written a long time ago by the Brothers Grimm. And the lady that did the beautiful illustrations or pictures, her name is Trina Shart Hyman. Stories that were written a long time ago, they start off once upon a time. Well, once upon a time there was a little girl and her name was Elizabeth, and she lived with her mother at the edge of the village. And she had a wonderful grandmother that loved her very much. And on Red Riding Hood's birthday, she went to her grandmother's house and she had made her a beautiful red cloak, and it also had a beautiful red hood on it. And Red Riding Hood put this cloak on, and she wore it everywhere she went. And from then on, she was known as Little Red Riding Hood. Well, one morning when Red Riding Hood got up, her mother said, "Come here, Red Riding Hood." She said, "I made this loaf of bread and this sweet butter, and I have this bottle of wine, and I want you to take it to your grandmother. She's sick today, and this should make her feel much better. But when you go to grandmother's, I want you to go directly to her house. Don't stop, and don't talk to strangers. And when you get there, always remember your manners. You have to say, 'Good morning, thank you, and please.'" And so Red Riding Hood started on her way to grandmother's house. And who do you suppose she met? As soon as she got started, she met the wily old wolf, and he was already thinking about eating this wonderful little girl. The wolf said, Good morning, Red Riding Hood." And Red Riding Hood said, "Good morning, Mr. Wolf." And he said, "And where are you off to this beautiful morning?" And Red Riding Hood told him that she was on her way to her grandmother's house. The wolf said, "Is that so? And what do you have in your basket?" And Red Riding Hood said, "My mother and I made a loaf of bread yesterday, and I have sweet butter and a bottle of wine for my grandmother. She's not feeling well, and this should make her feel good." And the wily old wolf said, "Well, where does your grandmother live?" And Red Riding Hood told him she lived about 15 minutes farther into the woods, and she lived near 3 big oak trees, and there was a beautiful stream that went past her house. And now the wolf is thinking, perhaps I can eat the grandmother and Red Riding Hood. And so the wolf talked to Red Riding Hood, and he said, "Look at the beautiful flowers in the woods. Your grandmother would love to have some flowers. Why don't you pick some for her?" And Red Riding Hood thought about it for a minute, and she thought that would be nice. I can take grandmother some beautiful flowers. And so she told the wolf, "Goodbye, Mr. Wolf." And she went on her way, forgetting what her mother had told her, and she went into the woods farther, and she picked flower after flower, and every one was more beautiful than the one before. And when she went farther into the woods, the wolf went right to grandmother's house. And here's the wolf. And what is he doing? He looks like he's knocking on the door. Let me help you knock. Knock along with me. And the wily old wolf said, "Grandmother, it's Red Riding Hood." And grandmother said, "I'm too weak to come to the door. Lift the latch and come on in." And so the wolf opened the door, and he walked into grandmother's house, and he ran into her room, and he swallowed her whole. Red Riding Hood didn't have a grandmother anymore. And the wolf, he put on grandmother's gown and her bed cap, and he got under her covers and pulled him right up to his chin. And then Red Riding Hood, she thought about her grandmother. She stopped picking flowers. She had a handful. And she said, "Oh, I must hurry to grandmother's house." And she rushed to her grandmother's house, and when she got there, the door was open. And Red Riding Hood became a little bit scared. And she had never been frightened before when she got to her mother's house, her grandmother's house. And she walked in and she said, "Grandmother, are you here?" And her grandmother didn't say anything. And she walked a little bit farther and she pulled the curtain back at her grandmother's bed. And she looked at her grandmother and she said, "Good morning, grandmother." But there was no answer. And then she pulled the curtain back a little bit farther, and there lay her grandmother. But she had a shawl drawn up around her, and it was covering her face, and she looked very odd. Red Riding Hood couldn't help but to stare. And she said, "Grandmother, what big hairy ears you have." And the wolf said, "The better to hear you with, my dear." And then Red Riding Hood said, "Oh, grandmother, your eyes are so shiny." And the wolf said, "The better to see you with, my dear." And then Red Riding Hood looked at her hands and she said, "Grandmother, your hands look so strange." And the wolf said, "The better to catch you and hold you with, my dear." And Red Riding Hood said, "Please, grandmother, why do you have such big teeth?" And at that moment, the wolf said, "The better to eat you with, my dear." And he swallowed Red Riding Hood whole, just like he did her mother, her grandmother. And the wolf was so full by this time, he laid back down on grandmother's bed and he went fast asleep. And he was snoring so loud. Let me hear you snore. Are you snoring? Well, that's what that old wolf was doing. And you know who came by? The hunter that lived in the village. He came by and he heard the loud snoring and coming from grandmother's house. And he walked closer, and then he walked up to the door and he kind of pushed the door open a little bit. And he walked inside, and there was the wolf asleep in grandmother's bed. And first the hunter was going to shoot him, and then he thought, perhaps grandmother is still alive in there. And so he cut the wolf's neck off, and then he took his knife and he cut open the stomach. He had to kill the wolf first, so that's why he cut his neck off. And he cut open the stomach, and he saw a red cape. And he cut it a little bit bigger, and out popped Little Red Riding Hood. And then he cut another big cut, and grandmother popped out. And grandmother and Red Riding Hood were so happy to see the woodsman. And they both said, thank you so much." And Little Red Riding Hood told the hunter, she said, "It was scary and dark in there." And she said, "Thank you again." And as soon as the hunter left, Red Riding Hood and her grandmother sat down and they ate all of the loaf of bread, the sweet butter, and grandmother drank some wine, and Red Riding Hood had a cup of blackberry tea. And when it was time for her to go home, Little Red Riding Hood said, "I will never ever wander off the path again as long as I live. I should have kept the promise I made to my mother." And then she thought about it and she said, "Well, I did remember my manners. I said good morning, I said please and thank you. And that's what you have to remember also, boys and girls. You have to remember your manners. But the first thing you have to remember is you always remember to do what your mom and your dad tell you. And one thing is you never talk to strangers. And if someone comes upon you when you're walking to school or walking back home and they say something or try to talk to you, you yell as loud as you can and you run to the first door that you can, or you run back to school and you tell them someone was bothering you on your way home. And that way you'll always be safe. All right, all right, boys and girls, thank you for joining me this evening, and you have a good night. Bye-bye.